All right. Good morning. I am really thrilled to see all of you here today for our, how many symposiums? Which one is this? The 10th. You're going to hear that over and over today. Seeing you here, seeing people who've been here from the very first one, they're 10 for 10. Dr. Dan Didek, shout out to you. And former students, current and former students, reminds me why we all do this work collectively, all of us, part of the Peace and Conflict Studies program and the center, and all the other staff who support us. And I'll try not to cry today, but it is a very emotional day. My name is Shirin Kaderson Khosropur. I'm director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, and I'm a psychology professor. I'm also an immigrant, a non-native speaker of English, and I got my own start at a community college, like many of you who are here today. I'm a huge fan of community colleges. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, or PACS, you'll also hear me call it PACS, Matthew Martinez-Mendel, Michelle Guillen, Dr. Kathy Frost, I'd like to welcome you to today's symposium. And I forgot, and on behalf of our advisory committee. I don't have their names here, but look up on our website, austincc.edu/peace. Look at the long list of names, faculty, staff, and administrators from different areas of the college, from different disciplines, different areas of study are on the advisory team because the program is truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. Our returning partners in today's program are departments of dance and art and the art galleries. And we appreciate the support of the Dean of Liberal Arts, Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Dean Stewart, and Associate Vice Chancellor of Academic Programs, Dr. Elizabeth Knight. Also thanks to Division of Arts and Digital Media, Office of Energy and Sustainability, for helping us today to keep our event as close to zero waste as possible. They're outside the door. They'll help you figure out where to deposit your trash. ACC's Culinary Arts and Interpreter Services, Dr. Sherry Blakey, my colleague in psychology, our volunteers, all of them my students. They were here at 7 o'clock this morning. Find them wearing our 10th anniversary t-shirts and talk to them. They're fascinating people. Farah Coffee for once again showing up with their coffee and their staff to sustain us with coffee all day long. Ask them about the Farah Foundation and the good work that that foundation does. And the community organizations that are tabling outside. Circle around during lunch and learn about the good work that they do as well. Special thanks to my former colleague, Renee Renteria, who once again is telling the story of our time together with his photography. Renee's deep interest in people and their stories and his appreciation of the power of togetherness comes through in his photos. You can find examples of his work on our website and more of his photos on his own website, Renee Renteria Photography. Okay, so you'll keep hearing today, this is the 10th anniversary of our symposium. What sparked the first? Unlike many things that happen in big institutions, this wasn't something the higher-ups made us do. I want to tell a short version of the story because I want you students to get a sense of your power, the power you have individually, but even more so together with other students. In 2012, we tested out the first course with a focus on peace and conflict studies. It was an Intro to Psychology course that I taught at the Rio Grande campus. Halfway into the semester, students were so taken by what they were learning about peace studies and conflict studies that they thought everyone should know about PACS. First, they wanted to literally knock on as many class doors as they could and give testimony. inform and promote. But we found a grant, applied for it, got the grant, and put together the first symposium. And we used the $1,000 the grant gave us to feed everybody lunch, because Peace Studies says you should take care of people's basic needs. The first symposium brought in over 120 people, and my students did almost all the presentations themselves. Our keynote speaker, who had come from the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., said he had never seen anything like it. Their talks were at the level of graduate students, and they were mesmerizing. That didn't come easy. These students took ownership of the work. They coordinated schedules and had us meet 2 to 3 evenings a week for weeks to prepare for the symposium. So what was it that spoke to those students so strongly that lit this fire in them? They were a pretty typical group of ACC students. See if you find similarities to yourself in them. 3 were Army veterans, 2 were moms of young children, 1 had a master's degree from New York University, 1 was a high school student, 1 self-identified as queer, 1 was a dance major, 1 was a physics major, another was a journalism major, and the rest didn't know what their majors were going to be yet. Really not much different from a typical ACC class, only the class size was a little smaller. And most of them had experienced traumas of one type or another. That's not unusual either. The National Institute of Health reports that over 70% of the population has experienced a traumatic event, and 30% have been exposed to 4 or more traumatic events. These percentages hold for the global population also. Notice this isn't the percent who have post-traumatic stress disorder, but people who have experienced trauma. So let's get a speedy micro version of peace studies and conflict studies and see if you can identify what may have been so appealing to this first group of students. All right, when you hear the word peace and the word conflict, what comes to mind? Typically, peace is associated with calm, acceptance, meditation, love, getting along, all kinds of good things to incorporate in your life. But it seems somewhat passive. Conflict is active, but you want to remove it from your life. Fighting, hurting, maybe even violence, alienation, things you want to eliminate. But both peace and conflict are much more nuanced, and that's what resonated with that year 1 class. By the mid-1950s, in a 30-year span, Europe had experienced 2 back-to-back major wars. World War II alone caused the deaths of about 60 million soldiers and civilians. It was also the first war that killed more civilians than soldiers. So people were interested in not only stopping wars, but also in sustaining peace so that another war wouldn't pop up. Johan Galtung was a Norwegian sociologist and is considered the founder of modern peace studies, which is now a formal academic discipline all over the world with prestigious universities in the US, including Texas, offering undergraduate and graduate programs. Like conflict, peace can be studied and practiced at any level, from intrapersonal, within a person, all the way to between countries. Galtung distinguished between 2 types of peace, negative peace and positive peace. Both are necessary and desirable. You have negative peace when you have stopped active, organized violence. Negative peace is also sometimes called security studies. Stopping violence, like a ceasefire, is part of negative peace. But negative peace isn't enough to sustain peace. Unless we foster positive peace, damaging conflicts will bubble up again. We have positive peace when we have eliminated indirect violence. That's economic, social, and cultural systems that prevent people from meeting their needs and achieving their full potential. For example, if we celebrate free speech, but structural and cultural systems make people afraid to speak up against war crimes, against laws that make pregnant women unsafe, and/or against structures that force children to prepare for mass shooting events, we don't have positive peace. We have positive peace when we have created conditions, attitudes, institutions, and structures that can support a sustainable peace. Here's an example. We don't have positive peace if some people have so much clean water that they can swim in drinkable water, but others are dying of diseases caused by unsafe drinking water. In 2020, globally, unsafe water killed more than 480,000 people. The US looks pretty good in the global data, but if you zoom in and look carefully, as in the CDC data, we see that in the US, in a 6-year time span, millions of people got sick from unsafe water and thousands died. We can find similar trends for food and housing security, for example. Some people have outrageous resources and others have none or struggle. So positive peace is most similar to a concept you're already familiar with. A sustainable peace requires social justice. Of course, it needs other things too. Some might be truth, mercy, reconciliation, patience, foresight to look not just through the close-up immediate lens, but to see the immediate problems in the context of relationship patterns and structures that hold those relationships and patterns together. In conflict studies, we see conflicts as a normal and natural part of all relationships. In fact, they can disrupt unhealthy and unjust patterns and move us toward positive peace. Conflicts can damage relationships, or they can be transformative in a good way to build something better. Typically, those who benefit from the status quo are likely to resist and resent conflicts that call for change. They don't want you to rock the boat. If you have negative peace already, so direct violence may be low, but you don't have positive peace, creating conflict or escalating conflict may be necessary to move toward building a better relationship and better structures. Conflict creates energy, and we can use that energy to start building something better. So don't be afraid of conflict. We can all practice skills for moving relationships toward justice and harmony in conflict. So why conflict transformation and not conflict resolution or conflict management? Conflict transformation is built on two foundations: a positive orientation toward conflict and a willingness to engage in conflict again and again and again to produce constructive change or growth. Conflict resolution and conflict management tend to focus on the immediate presenting problem. For example, a landlord and tenant have a conflict. That conflict can be managed or resolved without looking at the pattern of the interactions and relationships between these two parties. The one incident may get resolved, but the pattern may continue and the relationship may even get worse. The landlord may resent the tenant for making a complaint. The tenant may realize how other tenants are being treated better, or that there is a pattern of mistreating tenants that goes beyond their own issue. Conflict transformation anticipates this and doesn't stop. Conflict transformation deals not only with the immediate problem, but looks at the deeper structures and relationship patterns to see what needs to change and is committed to keeping the process going. At our center, we consider conflict and peace at all of these levels because they're all interconnected. And today, you have the opportunity to engage with great people at all of these levels, from the intrapersonal conflict within the person to interpersonal, intra-group conflict within a group, and conflict between groups, including nation states. Notice that each level of conflict can impact the other layers. Intrapersonal conflict can feed or escalate even international conflict. Conversely, a good interpersonal relationship can benefit negotiations in international diplomacy, for example. So, if peacebuilding jobs interest you, as many of you noted when you registered for the symposium, you should know what kinds of jobs you could pursue with it. What are peace-building jobs? Do people get paid for this? What do you actually do? Here's a brief description, much of it from a book by David Smith, who was instrumental in getting our program going, actually, from the beginning. He was at U.S. Institute of Peace at the time. And you will hear more about jobs in peace later today. Peacebuilding is used for international problems and also for domestic and community-based issues. For example, to focus on gun violence, bullying, social justice, domestic violence, education, climate change policies and action, LGBTQI+ issues, incarceration issues, and many, many more. Peacebuilding jobs can be considered direct action or indirect action. When the work is directly in organizations whose mission is peacebuilding, they are direct action. For example, work in organizations that focus on human rights, environmental protection, and economic development may be direct action jobs. Local examples of these types of organizations include CASA of Travis County, Casa Marianela, SAFE, Foundation Communities, Central Texas Food Bank, Austin Tax Preparation, Austin Habitat for Humanity, Interfaith Action of Central Texas, People's Community Clinic, and many more. We have some of these community organizations outside here. So again, stop by during lunch or a break and talk with them. The jobs themselves can be anything in these organizations. Every organization needs staff in a variety of positions. People who can do web development, accounting, grant writing, management, education, communication and public relations, programming, human resources, social media, basically anything that an organization needs. Then depending on the mission of the organization, they may need engineers, educators, therapists, health professionals, lab technicians, welders, healthcare professionals, I think I already said that, and others. It's a very wide range. There's another way to look at opportunities for being a peace builder, promoting peace and conflict transformation. And this is really an endless range of occupations. And that's working in organizations where peace building is not the prime objective of the organization, but peace building can be an important addition to the work. My job and my PAX colleagues' jobs here, for example, none of us was hired to teach peace and conflict studies. We're grateful to the ACC administration for allowing us to develop these programs, and now we are peace builders working in education. As you watch performances and listen to our panelists today, and you see Rene move through with his camera for photography, consider how their work as artists, academics, and professionals intersects with peace building. Can you imagine how a peace and conflict studies approach can intersect with work in law enforcement, education, healthcare, the sciences, engineering, business and management, real estate development? We really do need that in Austin, don't we? The peace and conflict studies lens in that area. And in public transportation, like where to do the expansion of a new highway in the city like we have, human resources, and so on. If you're interested, any of us on the PAX team can help you discuss the potential relevance of peace and conflict studies to your own major or career interest. Also, increasingly, people are talking about AI-proof jobs, jobs that artificial intelligence can't do. The soft skills that come in a degree like peace and conflict studies are AI-proof. When you're working on human relationships, which are the basis of all other layers we look at, AI can't replace us, not yet anyway. Recent attempts to let AI do psychotherapy, for example, have not been successful. It's important to think about job readiness when thinking about what to study. Most of us need jobs to live independently. We spend most of our waking hours working, so what we do contributes significantly to our overall sense of well-being. Research shows that money does not buy happiness. Beyond the amount we need to meet our basic needs, Extra money does not significantly increase happiness levels. One way to increase happiness is to find work that is meaningful to us. Value-based happiness is the sense that our lives have meaning and fulfill some larger purpose. Look at the Venn diagram here. Lucky are those of us who can wade our way to a job right at the center where the circles converge. Start from the top, look at the top circle, find something you love, move to the left, something that you're good at or you can get good at. That's what education is for. And then something that you can get paid for and something that makes the world a better place. And you're at that red center in the middle. That's the sweet spot. And that's where all of us at ACC want to help you get to. Okay, with that, I am thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. George Lopez. George is Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies at University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, where he was a founding member. George has asked me to skip all the accolades and to introduce him simply as a friend of our program. And we are so lucky to have George as a friend. It's George's deep commitment to supporting and nurturing the development of peace studies and peace-building education in colleges and universities that brought us to him. He's founding director of the Kroc Institute's annual Summer Institute on Teaching Peace in the 21st Century, where we got a good start toward developing our own program when we first attended in June of 2010. And then again in 2018 with several faculty who were by then teaching in our Peace and Conflict Studies program. George, thank you for your guidance and friendship and for joining us today. I'm turning this over to you.
But I have to ask Professor Shirin not to leave yet because I need her assistance with the first thing I'm doing. Would you be so kind as to hold the microphone for a moment? Okay. I have here Teaching Peace in the 21st Century, Summer Institute for Faculty, 2010. And read some of the names, would you please, of the institutions.
Look at that. Abilene Christian, Woohoo, Texas, Austin Community College, and there were Portland Community College, and what's the other? Valencia Community College. There were 3 community colleges.
And some of the others?
All right, some of the others. Do we care about universities? Maybe. Arizona State, Caribbean Citizens Reconciliation Commission, Coastal Carolina University, College of the Holy Cross, Marquette University, Norwalk Community College, Nyack College, Oklahoma City University, Portland, we said that, St. Norbert College, United States Institute of Peace, University of Haifa, University of Louisville, Massachusetts Lowell, Notre Dame, of course, and University of Tennessee, Knoxville.
Applause for the person who led this in 2010.
Thank you.
And indication of the wonder of T-shirts in every peace conference. They last forever. But I think that was a wonderful indication in 2010, which I think was our 3rd Summer Institute of bringing people together, of what was happening in higher education to try to get not just formalization of the teaching that was going on, but a greater national integration by bringing essentially what I called summer camp for faculty. There were a number of incriminating photos of some of those faculty playing summer camp that we didn't bring today. The people both in 2010 and 2018 from ACC were very well behaved, but people learned from one another dramatically. And part of the reason why I brought the T-shirt was partly to give evidence, because I didn't know you were going to talk about going there, but also that was as we were accepting applications that year. It was the first year we had applications from community colleges. And I called David Smith, a good friend, and he said, yeah, this is going on like crazy. And he later did another book on community colleges and what was happening. And this is just a national trend. But you folks have been in the lead for a good long while. And so I'm delighted to be here. and delighted to have been a little bit present at the beginning roads of creation. So, we have a marvelous title. What does peace have to do with it? And a focus on transforming conflicts in our relationships, in our careers, in our communities. So I want to explore this with you a bit in kind of an interactive way, and then have some other things to say that are very much building from what Shirin has kicked us off on for what the field means overall on this. So, need a little audience participation and help here from you. What conflicts are in your life, in relationships, in career, in community? What are the conflicts that you would hope, in the best sense, you would be transformers of?
I'm going to go grab.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And while she's running, I'll even share a first mic as well. If you stay up there, and I'll be
I'm
here,
ready,
and then people can talk. Okay, great. So who wants to start with, generically or in particular, what conflicts do you see needing transformation?
I think a common thing people go through, my brother-in-law is currently in a messy divorce. And so there's children involved, and the conflict with how do I deal with my sister-in-law and what's her role in the family now as they go through this process. And divorce is very common. So I think that's something.
One of the more deeply painful situations for all human people who have been involved in that, certainly. Thank you. Yes.
I have an interpersonal conflict where I'm trying to strike a balance between maybe focusing more on career versus focusing more on my child. I have a 7-year-old and I only work half time, which has like limited opportunities. And I know I have a lot of skills that have more opportunities. So I'm really like in conflict about, do I continue to focus on her and like giving her more of me, or do I start to look more at myself and like my own future with my career? And so that's a conflict I've had in myself lately, really trying to figure out like what's next for me and how does that affect her?
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that most law is based on conflict. We say person X versus the second person in a lawsuit. We say it's all conflict based. So just all of our legal systems are based on conflict.
And that's often why the term adversarial is used. This is an adversarial conflict. Interesting, as I think some of you know, the law profession about 30 years ago started to think about this and decided that maybe they could teach not alternatives to litigation, because everybody has a right in our culture in the US to have their day in court, but alternative dispute resolution, which meant that both parties would come with an intent not to totally defeat the other in a zero-sum way, but to work together to a resolution that would be acceptable, even though this is a messy divorce, or even though this is a messy tenant and landlord kind of situation. Others? Way in the back. Thank you.
This is a great opportunity to mention the conflict relationship among the stakeholder groups at an institution like Austin Community College with regard to perquisites, power, status, prestige, etc.
Thank you.
In the Austin community recently, we have had our unhoused community they changed a law so they could not live in areas where you could see them. So now a lot of our unhoused community has the conflict of trying to coexist while also hiding, which is more unsafe. And so it's kind of a conflict between city ordinances and people's lives.
Thank you. Any others? This gets us off to a very good start. But then begs the next question. Transformation to what? What do we want to transform our relationships? What do we want to transform our inner struggles, our stakeholder versus the rest of us. Transformation to what?
What comes to mind are words like respect, communication, understanding, and hopefully a win-win ultimately resolution to the conflict. But bottom line is that there still is a relationship throughout the conflict.
I didn't hear victory and defeat in your characterization. Resolution, sometimes restitution, but the conflict and the linkage between us may be overcome, but is a new relationship built? It might not, it probably, given us being humans, wouldn't wind up being conflict-free, but it doesn't mean that the conflict needs to be destructive. And one of the distinctive things I think that Shirin and I and others have learned in our privileged position of teaching and growing in this field is it's a very optimistic approach to human relationships that many of us find not always confirmed by our experience, right? We're trying to work on a way in which we come from a framework that conflict is a positive manifestation of people sort of standing up for themselves. Because you said respect. People want to be respected. They want to be heard. They want to be understood. But they also don't want to stay where they are necessarily in this spot. Because whether it's internal or whether it's with others, quite disturbing. Get your heart rate going. Ruins the blood pressure. Costs you resources. Costs you attention to all the other things that you value. So how do we bring the things that we value to bear in this? And I think that's one of the things that's been wonderful to observe over the last 20 or 30 years in the development of peace studies, both at the community level and even in some cases at the international level, but certainly in our teaching and programs like this, is that very important to learn those conflict resolution skills, but not to stop there, but to think about where else we go and why we go there. And some of that is what I'd like to address with us, in addition to a couple of other kinds of things. For example, I got this notice just before I left for Austin here. If you can't read it, it says, "Dear Professor, I know you must be a very busy person, but I'm a big fan of your work." All professors like to hear that. You know, that's really kind of like that. "And I hope that you can find the time to help me with my project. I'm writing to prominent leaders and other influential citizens across America, asking each of you the following vital, important question. How do you think we can achieve world peace?" I've enclosed a 3x5 card for your reply. So, I didn't bring 3x5 cards, but I'd like to invite you for the next couple of moments to reflect on, maybe even write down, how do we get to world peace? Because we talked about all the good things about transformation just a moment ago. If we were able to solve many of the things in our spatial life around us, family, friends, community, Austin, our institutions, does that tell us anything about world peace? Or is world peace just a stratosphere away? So think about that for a moment. How do we get to world peace? We have our first volunteer. Right here. Oh, I should be giving you the microphone. I went pointing to other people. Okay.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, we have to go back to the collapse of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the so-called Iron Age and get it right, because we seem to have missed a step, and the era of dualism up to the present, has been an age of conflict. By definition, dualism is conflict, So we have to get it right and get it the whole instead of the dualism. Get it a holistic age, a holistic era.
A holistic era. Thank you. Others?
Well, part of what NATO is trying to do, obviously, we're trying to form alliances and having common goals and ways of trying to do that. Unfortunately, that's not going to take us far enough because there's not enough alliances, if you will, with our 190 countries we have going now. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. But that's one of the steps would be what alliances, what goals do we have, what common goals?
Others? Way in the back there. Thank you.
Well, one of my favorite pacifists and a Nobel laureate, Bertrand Russell, advocated internationalism, the abolition of nationalism. That is definitely one avenue that could be pursued.
And to build from what Jerry said, the notion that we have 198 divisions in the world called nation states, when most of us don't look that different. We're blessed by having multiracials in the world, different cultures and ethnicities. There's lots of difference, but I'm not sure there's 198 differences. Thank you.
I was kind of wondering about, like, when you were describing it, is it a culmination of just the levels of individual action? Like, can world peace just be, because I can't affect what NATO is doing, not like directly, but in the role I play, like as an individual with one-to-one in my sphere and the actions I make, if everyone kind of, not necessarily acts similarly, right, but has an orientation towards like that relationship building and looking at the things that their values and finding commonality, does that then just escalate across? Do you get it by building up that way?
That's a great phrase, spilling up. Very nice.
I think that while world peace is certainly the ideal, if we're being more realistic, there's not going to be a time without conflict. So I think that a better utilization of resources would be to prioritize peace and resolution building versus to try and get everyone under peace, because people have tried and it hasn't worked.
Empire building was notion of, hi, we're the Romans, we're here to bring you peace.
Rather than any one solution, I think believing that it's possible at all is a really important step. We always think about world peace as something that's not achievable and something that is this impossible problem. But if we start from a place of believing that it is, and we have the creativity to imagine what the world would look like without it, I think we could go far.
Thank you. We have this phrase in culture, if you build it, they will come. Well, maybe if you conceptualize it, you can create it. Have the back, and then we'll come to you, Ellen.
I actually think about this question a lot, but talking to like close friends and family members about what they think is a good idea to achieve world peace, everyone thinks that they are in the right. And of course, I think that is worldwide, but I think a very important step to at least begin to get to that is just having conversations, having an open mind while having conversations and getting to know each other's thoughts so that we are able to see where they're coming from and understand and hopefully come to a middle ground.
Thank you.
I'd very much like to follow up with what she referenced. As someone who's lived around the world with a strong background in culture and anthropology, I think it's important to make an effort to learn another culture, their history, their values, their tragedies, and what is shaping them, so you have a better understanding of where they're coming from, where you're coming from, and where you might be able to find places as a starting off point. But first things first, you have to make an effort to learn and understand other cultures, nation states, and their beliefs and their values and where they're coming from. Maybe not identifying with it or this kind of thing, but at least understanding where their cultures, where they're coming from a cultural and historical perspective.
And that they're not coming there from some evil intent to inflict on your culture. Yeah. So wonderful. Yes.
Just to follow up on the word respect, because I think a lot of times it's us versus them, and we don't see the commonalities, and we're right, you're wrong. It's that black and white thinking. And, you know, we ought to start somewhere, but understanding that we do have common values and that we all are human beings. And anyway.
And, you know, if you stayed up late last night, boom, yet another poor reflection on any embracing of this concept as we see yet continued bombing, thank goodness limited, between Israel and Iran, where instead of asking the question, and I'm not being, not anti-Israeli here, instead of the Israeli decision makers asking the question, when the Iranians bombed us or sent the bombings to us and then said, this evens the score, it's done, why was our first reaction, and Israel's like every other national decision maker faced with the same thing, the first reaction is, well, we're going to respond, and what's the character of our response going to be? As opposed to, what did they mean when they said this is done, and they did that? How do we test that out without going to the next level of bombing? Or is the national security psyche bent on the nation that we must assert our will, and then they have their own problems with their own will, even if it keeps coming back to us, whichever the us we are, Israeli, Palestinian, Iranian, Mexican, whoever. Yes, another observation.
The first thing that pops up in my mind is access. As growing up in Texas, I don't have access to education, to other cultures and views of other countries. So if we can all have access to be able to learn about everybody in different cultures, I feel like that would help us kind of bridge the gap a little bit.
Yeah. And we may be fortunate to live in a big and growing city where those cultures sometimes descend on us for whatever reasons from afflicted areas. The wonderful woman who was my Uber driver this morning from the hotel to here, I said, oh, where are you from? And she says, oh, the Congo. And I said, and for how long have you been here? And she shared some of her story. And she said, have you ever been? I said, no, I've been to Uganda, I've been to Rwanda, but I was never involved in Congo, but I've had a number of students from Congo. And as I was getting out of Uber, she said, please don't tip me. And I said, no, I'm going to tip you. She said, no, the value of the conversation was worth it for me all day. And it was just, you know, what am I? I'm an old international relations prof. I find out where somebody's from. For me, it was a usual conversation. For her, it was somebody listened. And so we may have that opportunity never to go before the UN Security Council, but we may find through our community relations, through our church relations, through educational opportunity, the other, the one we've never experienced and whose conceptual framework or language or culture we've not experienced on our own. It can come right to us and give us an understanding of relationships that widen our worldview and may create our own little base, our own little place and a cornerstone for peace, widely understood. Well, thank you. Now I can put together these on 3x5 cards and send them back to my correspondent friend here now. So, whoops, don't press the button too hard, George. So, what do we know or think we know from peace and conflict studies about peace and conflict, and particularly some of the conflict side of it, that's going to impact what kind of transformation we may want and work towards, and what kind of peace at local or global levels we might want. I think part of our, some would say good fortune, some would say burden, some would say misfortune of living in this emerging first half of the 21st century is we're seeing too many cycles of conflict and violence. And we're seeing them at both the local and the global level. Depends on how much news you watch or what kind of neighborhood you watch in and live in. But it's also the case these are increasingly converging. You're the state that's the focus in our national discussion, if you will, if it would at least be a discussion of importance and sensitivity, of the invasion that's coming through our southern border. The old understanding of migration of this type was often economic. Increasingly, it's not economic, as you know. It's driven by people who want to get away from gang violence in Salvador or repressive death squads in Guatemala or drug gangs in Mexico. In other words, they're fleeing cycles of violence. And the violence, of course, is not only perilous on its own, but it also costs you an opportunity to just live a normal life, raise a family, and try to work and have that work mean something for your family. So yes, of course, people engage in incredible risks to get through that border, to have at least a sense where the drug lords, a repressive government, and others won't hunt them. So there's a link here, an inextricable link between Texas as a place of our locale, or your locale, and the world stage, the cycles of violence in at least 3 or 4 other countries. So I think increasingly in the study of peace and conflict, we've learned a little bit too much like politics. All conflict and violence is local in one form or another. It gets increasingly up close and personal. Certainly that's the case of school violence, gun violence, etc. Thus, many of us think that the role of conflict transformation is to give us skills to try to cope and rebuild from this violence at whatever level our community and ourselves may experience it. And that conflict transformation is one of the cornerstones of a wider peace building, even if your interests aren't in the wider world, because the local peace building skills are needed in so many ways and in multiple ways in our communities. Conflict transformation and peace building now have a new expansive list of where the opportunities are to work on, but also, if we're pessimistic about it, so many more local needs than we had 2 or 3 decades ago. And that's both an opportunity, but obviously for all of us living in this age, a kind of burden. The notion that you went to bed at maybe 10 p.m. last night and then woke up this morning and find out there's a potential for a new war in the Middle East, as Israel and Iran keep jockeying for position of superiority in the Middle East. You didn't need that before your first cup of coffee, did you? Probably not. So, Shirin has already outlined some of this so perfectly well. It is important for us to learn conflict resolution and conflict resolution skills. Maybe even in our own future, for us, it's building enough skills that we're professionals in this in some way, in negotiation or mediation. And it's also important to understand that that kind of way of either adversarially or cooperatively dealing with helping people resolve their disputes, we've learned a lot about the conditions under which that works and it doesn't work. In particular, we learn that conflict resolution and a standard sit across the table. Let's see what we can do. You take that half a loaf of bread, I'll take this half a loaf of bread, and let's march on, whether it's divorce or neighbor relations or labors and management, et cetera, et cetera. That works when it works, mostly because the parties have a relatively equal status, equal concern with let's get over this and get on with it. But it doesn't work in conflicts among unequals. Or to put it more pointedly, it doesn't work in conflicts that are steeped in injustice. So part of why the conflict resolution field watched and invented and accompanied this thing called conflict transformation is that we understood so many conflicts that looked like they were resolved because people signed a piece of paper, either a community agreement or a peace treaty, and then they fell apart later. Why? Because the parties and their needs and their resources and their ability to march forward after that paper agreement was so limited because they were unequal. Unequal and injustice-based conflict needs something more than just, okay, come on, you give a little, I'll give a little, and then let's get out of here. Excuse me, my Brooklyn, New York twang comes in when I get going on that, especially if you're saying, get out of here. So, compromise, as virtuous as it might be, and as useful to have a skill to do this, is limited. And our view coming in must not be, or we have to help our friends and neighbors try to get above this notion of, okay, I'm here. I'm here because you told me I got to be here. I don't like it. I don't like them. But let's get over this. The get over this for this thing is only going to lead us to the next thing, which is more of a separation, more of a battle, more of a disagreement. Hopefully not more violence, but it might be. So one of the things that we know is, yes, it's important to get skills, listening skills, cooperative skills, dialogue skills, be based in an I dialogue with others. All these things in conflict resolution and conflict management. All of this is important, but it's important with an eye towards, is this going to be enough? Is this the way it should work in a long and sustainable time? It's a good basis, a great basis and springboard for getting to transformation, but it's difficult to be in the conflict and peace business, whether it's with little children working out disputes or it's at the higher level, without an eye and a consciousness towards how we're really going to do transformation here. Because it's probably a conflict that's going to need transformation down the road. How do we have the skills? What are the entry points? What's the diversity of skills and people we need as we aim to build a new relationship between the parties? Especially when maybe each of them, they don't want a new relationship. They don't think they need one. It's the last thing they're thinking about. But can they grow in their dialogue with us as insiders to or outsiders of the conflict in a way in which they understand we share a process and a hope for creating a shared future? I've had the incredibly good fortune over the years to have a lot of international students come through the Kroc Institute. Mrs. Kroc, who was the heir to the McDonald's fortune, gave us more millions of dollars than any university should have to try to do this, but she did it with an interesting stipulation. Of the 20 to 25 people we admitted to the master's program every year, 18 of them had to be, at least 18, had to be from conflict going on in another country outside the United States. And one of the things I would hear from people, whether it was in survivors from Rwanda or Sierra Leone or Guatemala or Palestine, was, you know, at the end of the day, their people and our people don't want our grandchildren still fighting over this crap. And sometimes they would say different words for crap. So the notion of hopes, of shared hopes, may be a pretty thin thing to build a transformative process on, but it is one of the things that ring true with people. And I think a core strategy for peace is then thinking about what are the transformative opportunities that are presented to us, whether we're a second-year student here at ACC or what might be considered for some of us the Social Security generation, whether we're at that sort of beginning chronological stage or really up in the rafters on that chronological stage. It's very, very important that we understand that the basic skills we're trying to learn have real relevance for a wider understanding of peace. How is that so? Well, conflict transformation and peace building are built around a kind of same model. Now, this is funny always in an American audience because you put up the SAT model, somebody says, I don't need that test to get into college anymore. Or, I missed the time when you didn't need that test and the crazy universities are bringing it back in. But by SAT model here, we mean, thanks to Robert Resigliano, a great peace builder, how do we work on structural change, attitudinal change, and transactional change? And actually, sometimes I call this the TAS model because it really starts from the bottom up. What can I do in my community, in my situation, in my dynamic of the challenge of conflict and violence I'm facing? What can I do to try to take steps to transformation? The first and most important seems, as we learn from other examples, how do we maximize our linkages, either with these people that are dear to us, that are involved in the conflict, or we ourselves, and people outside this conflict, or the just other across the table? How do we maximize our exchanges so we get a sense of what cultural worldview are these people coming from? What situational worldview? What do they see as their unequalness to me? How do I reflect on my own positionality in this conflict? What if I'm the creator of the inequality because I hold the resources and I have some sympathy with what they want? But you got to understand, all the people I live with say, hey, we worked for what we got. These other people, why do we have to share this? Or why do we have to create a structure that's special for them, that's different from ours, that we used, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, even though what we're actually wearing is $300 pair of shoes, not exactly bootstraps? How do we take what our era and our situation will permit us to be dynamically interactive and maybe structure a set of relationships with the other fairly exchanged in ways that we learn about each other? And that can happen as simple as how a fourth grade teacher brings into a classroom some people who have come from this country called X or Y or Morocco or whatever, and they're living in our school system, and they came here to share with us some food and some ideas and a map of Morocco and talk about it with you all. And maybe someday some of you will go to Morocco and we'll bring students from Morocco as a high school exchange program, or on and on and on. Or maybe, as I'll talk a little bit about at the end, you're aiming for a profession, and I'm delighted we're going to have career discussions later in the day, and you say, I've always had that, go back to the convergent circles from Shirin, I have this passion to build things, architecture or something, I'm probably going to be an engineer, etc. And I want to do that. I want to contribute to world peace too, but what do? Well, maybe what you do is you become an engineer without borders. And just like Doctors Without Borders, you give 2 weeks of your life every year as a professional, successful engineer to go to a place in need and work with emerging engineers who really need the expertise and resource contacts of all of us as privileged outsiders, because we come from this country. Transactional changes. How do I get in dialogue myself with the others in this conflict? How am I part of it? That I have an obligation to increase our contacts? How do I find ways to help those understand and listen, building from my conflict resolution skills? But transactions aren't enough. Might leave us with a kind of feel-good feeling, say, well, at least we're talking to each other, but we need something else. We need these changes to go on at a larger level. We hope that the transactions bring us to a point at which we start to see someone else's worldview as at least reasonably legitimate, even if they're not in agreement with us. And we live in an interesting era because when Rob created this about 12 years ago, the world of social media was very, very different. And what we thought was we need attitude changes, which means that we need to continue to talk with people about the experiences we're having and interaction and how positive that is and where we might go with this. And maybe we can put some people in the room from our community who are kind of like attitude changers. People who other people listen to more than they listen to little old us. Who's the folks who are preaching on Sunday from what kinds of pulpits? Who are the rabbis and the Catholic priests and the Lutheran or other ministers that want to get together as a three-pronged panel after 9/11 and talk about what's the real understanding of the relationship between religion and violence in their traditions? Who are the educators, political people, TV advertisers that shape the attitudes of all the rest of us because they have a kind of mass appeal and they have contact with far more people through certain medium than we'll have? Now, all of that, Rob and others thought about in that world of 12 or 14 years ago. And what do we have now? Come on, let's be honest. Who in this room doesn't want to be an influencer on social media? The notion of being an individual influencer is not only aspirational for a lot of people, but depending on which 13-year-old you know, they may proclaim, I have 30,000 followers now. I'm an influencer. And all I did is say, you know what, I'm going to put purple laces on my white sneakers. Okay. But if people are following you and being impressed by that, what kind of real societal and peace-oriented things might they follow based on your role of acknowledging I can help change attitudes and I want others to help change attitudes? Because beyond transactions, we have to a change in attitude, because changes in attitude set forth the possibility of the real change, which is based on how do we change structures and institutions so that they don't foment continued injustice and continued conflictual images of the other. How do we find a way to change institutions that they become positive ways in which people can project their best hopes for community life together and building a shared future based on we all need to transform, and we're okay with doing that. But we're doing that with little baby steps, and we're doing that still a little bit scared, and we understand this is a tough thing, and sometimes it doesn't feel good. For all the right reasons of his personal life circumstances, the comedian and writer Woody Allen is distanced now from our general culture as an influencer, but I always thought, for better or worse, he gave us one of the great lines for peace studies. Yes, the lamb and the lion will lie together, but the lamb won't get much sleep. It's always tentative. It's always difficult to work with. It's always an experiment. It's always risky. But the risks and the costs are considerably less than the other solutions we seem to devise, which is new and dynamic ways to figure out how to kill one another. So, the U.S. Institute of Peace, David Smith, a number of the rest of us associated with that over time, got together and said, when we're talking with communities, especially international communities, how do we get people to understand where they might fit and other kinds of things with regard to all the violence that's going on in the world? And one of the things we created was this life cycle of conflict and peace. By the way, did you know if you're an American citizen and pay taxes, you pay taxes for this? USIP is created by Congress to work to help American foreign policy in its most peaceful side. Yes, we only got 0.0034 of the average Pentagon annual budget, but you got to start somewhere. And since congressionally funded and U.S. foreign policymakers want to know about peace and conflict, most of the time, until we created the chart, we were very, very focused on, if you draw a straight line through this normal distribution, everything on the left side. How do we help diplomats and other people who find themselves moving up the cycle of conflict? How do they get new skills in conflict resolution and transformation to do preventative diplomacy? How do they do crisis management? If violence breaks out, how do we do negotiations to get to a ceasefire? And we've seen this play out, over the last couple of months in the Middle East. Why is it so damn hard to get to a ceasefire? It's beyond just, let's say, the stubbornness and vision of one politician who heads Israel right now. It's built into the structure of the system. I'm not going to a ceasefire until I make sure I can do so with an advantage relative to the other side. So the competition and the violence continues. Well, we saw a lot of that, did a lot of that with the official folks, but so many of our missions in the field were focused on the right-hand side, in which you did some peacekeeping with the UN, you did various things, but very, very importantly, we learned, in part in listening and accompanying processes on the ground in civil wars, that there's this bottom area called post-conflict or post-violence peacebuilding, which is often the area, even at community levels, we find ourselves in. We weren't good enough, we weren't lucky enough, we didn't have enough the things fall into place to stop a cycle of violence, to prevent serious outbreaks. We weren't even good at stopping them or mitigating them in the midst of this. So we're left after either exhaustion or victory by a party, or when people finally have enough in a hurting stalemate that they're willing to say, okay, enough is enough. What are we left with? We're left with that bottom cycle. And what we were learning is, what does a society recovering from violence need to have transformed the violence into something that's positive as a community? And we looked at this and we heard people and we saw that, well, a lot of them need peace builders that are those attitude influencers based out of values that still are present even after the terrible war. They need religious peace builders, specifically clerics, theologians, and people. They need educators. Their school systems are destroyed. But what do the educators need to do? The educators need to have talent and training and understanding of, you're dealing with some people that are in their teens that actually haven't had any schooling in the last 10 years because the war has so disrupted that. As if that wasn't a pedagogical challenge enough, what about the trauma they've brought from their life running from violence or living in a refugee camp where there wasn't any structured schooling? How do you deal with that? How do you, let us say, in a future of a Middle East, have a school system in Palestine and a school system in Israel where the third grade textbooks don't reinforce an image of the other that they or you have a right to the land and the other should be driven into the sea? How do you deal with the stereotypes built into our educational system? So, if you wonder, does a 7th grade teacher make a difference? Yeah, a 7th grade teacher makes a difference. Maybe you're not going to be in the Middle East a couple of years from now doing it, but if you're going to do it in Austin, the same principles hold. Have the young people in my class gone through trauma? What trauma? What does that mean? How are they dealing with the inadequacies of their educational level as given to it by inadequate institutional prior background because of their poverty or their immigrant status? What are we using for educational material? And why don't they say anything about slavery in this material, for example, as seems to be a national trend? So, educators, healthcare professionals, rule of law people. It's important to have a structure of lawyers in a country and build up a new rule of law system. Community policing. We're going to talk a little bit about that this afternoon. Social workers, planners. One of the big booms in peace studies everywhere, the arts and peace. What happens in refugee life? People draw and kids draw. What's the meaning of that drawing? How do we elicit from them what that means as a way of trauma healing? Or Did the revolution for justice in this country that we're looking at, or in our community, did it start with street theater? What does street theater look like? What does that tell us as an expression of community? How do we get that expression of anger or resolution choices out more dramatically into the culture beyond the street corner and get people talking about? All of these things tell us that the array of us in this room have a huge potential for being peace builders, because a lot of your professional aspirations might be reflected here. So you'll be at that point of being able to not only follow your passion and your skills that you're good at, as Shireen put up in the Venn diagram, but you'll be in a situation where you can influence what are the transactions. You'll be an influencer at an attitude level, and you may even be caught in a structure in which you see clearly what the reformation needs to be in the structure in order to get us to these new spots. And what was interesting, as a number of us looked at that then here, is a couple of things happened. The first was politicians and some others kind of gave up and let events take their course. When you got to the top, violence broke out. There was nothing you could do. They tried the standard thing of, can we bring people to the negotiating compromise table, sign a peace agreement, and finally it's done. When real peace for people that were involved in the violence, many of us understood, was really the bottom part. And so if wars got you down and you're thinking, why am I in peace and conflict studies? The world's going to hell in a handbasket. There is a tomorrow. And who's going to be ready for tomorrow? Who's going to be still arguing for, yes, we need people skilled in preventive diplomacy and crisis management and those skills so we don't get to full outbreaks of violence. But the truth is, when violence happens, who are you going to call? And it's not Ghostbusters. You're going to call people doing this work and having them join people in the community who are already doing that work but need greater attention, resources, understanding, dialogue, and a relationship. The other thing that happened, and I think we talked about this often in the Teaching Peace Institute, is many of us, particularly those who came to peace studies from international affairs training, my life in a classroom, I might even overcharacterize it a little bit. If you drew that line down the middle again, when I'd go into an international relations intro classroom with about 150 people in a room like this, I couldn't help but think, now I wonder who's the one. Is it you? Is it you? Is it? No, it can't be you. Maybe is it you? I wonder who's going to, 25 years from now, after having intro to international relations with me with a strong peace emphasis, is going to be the assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State sitting at the table when they're having those discussions. I wonder who's going to be through the ROTC program here at Notre Dame and then be central command in that region when the issue is, how do we bomb this? And he raises or she raises the question, no, there's a step before bombing that we haven't done. That's a bias towards peace. Is there one here that might be like that? And then at that moment of decision, they'd say, oh, as Professor Lopez said back in 1980, I think we ought to do the following. I couldn't kind of get away from that self-promotional thing. But then I realized, come on, George, you're doing work with people in this lower right-hand quadrant. It's not who's the one. It's of all of these ones, where do they fit in that chart? Where's their calling to be peace builders and conflict transformers? Because we all have a role. And I think that's empowering, certainly to those of us who are your faculty, but it also be hopefully empowering to you. Who are these conflict transformers and peace builders? Yeah, some of them are professionals. We'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon, working in various ways because their skills and work link them together in the opportunity to be a community relations specialist or to be a negotiator or someone like that. But it's also and understanding that conflict transformation and peace-building skills are now the new citizenship education of our era, from kindergarten on. My toughest kind of early life in this field was the day I volunteered at nursery school with my firstborn, and I had sandbox duty. And I'm sitting out there on the ledge of the big sandbox, and they're playing with these figures. And my son Tom's playing with some, and some other guy's playing with another. And the other kid says to Tom, "You're the bad guys." And I said, "Well, what if there are no bad guys?" And simultaneously, the four young men in the sandbox said, "There's always bad guys." And I said, "Well, Tom, my son, I mean, you know, they're not always bad guys." And I got that stern look you can only get from a 5.5-year-old. Both, "You're embarrassing me," and "Dad, there are always bad guys." Oh, okay, that's a framework. How do I transform that into a vision that you don't always have to have bad guys or violent guys or guys who are better at clubbing one on the head than the other? So, who are the peace builders? Maybe even sometimes the roles we'll have as parents. And that's just the reality of life. Now, where do you all fit on this crazy wheel of life and the things that we have available to us? My hope as an outside visitor and someone who admires this program has had the ability to be part of your accompaniment of growth. I think and hope you will inspire, connect, and invent within the SAT and CT framework. Some of you think globally, but a lot of this will be acting locally. And you can become a person without borders, either without borders in a small community to extend to new visitors in your community, or you'll go to this little linkage that we have, and I think you're all going to have access to this whole PowerPoint, in which you find that from A to Z, there is something like 93 without borders communities. I spoke at a group a couple of years ago, ending with something like this, and a woman in the back of the room said, "Can I put in a plug for that? I didn't know that there were dentists without borders. And in particular, I'm a child dentist, so I specialize in little people's teeth. And in the US, that means often crowded teeth and braces, etc. But I had a friend who said, "Hey, I've heard that one of the things that was devastated in the Rwandan genocide was so much of the professional class of people who were dentists. I'm going over there for 2 weeks to deal and help children in camps and help children in resettling that have had no dental treatment whatsoever." And it started with 2 of them, then it turned out to be 6 of them. Then 10 years after they started this, they created a school of dentistry for children, specialist dentistry, in Rwanda. So this thing can get legs, even though you're just a simple, wonderful, caring local dentist. Enough said. I want us to use the rest of the time, your questions, your challenges. The floor is open. And someone's raising their hand. Good.
Yeah, thank you. That was extremely interesting. Well, I guess I would say, without castigating anybody as evil or bad guys, you haven't said much about the resistance. It seems to me the status quo in the world is the anti-peace building efforts by those empowered. The status quo, they're overwhelmingly powerful. And frankly, they seem to be winning. So you can convert those with ears to hear into being peace builders, but they are right up against people who have power, real power, and are sanctimonious. The Nazis were sanctimonious. That's very important to realize. They modified the educational process to get the product they wanted. And that's what we're dealing with now. If you look at Russia, they're actually modifying the educational program. I'd like to hear what you have to say about the opposition, the peace wreckers. What do you have to say about them?
So any other questions? No, it's very important. Thank you. The longer discussion that your question has raised, I think, gets to really 2 or 3 points. The first is a good peace analyst and peace builder understands the nature of evil. And that doesn't mean you have to think that in every human being lurks the seed of evil, and if only called to genocide, all of us would respond. But it is to have front and center that there is intrinsic evil in some people's worldview, and here's its characteristics, and I think we have to teach about that, or we have to reflect that as it's revealing itself in current news. But the second is there may be real difficulties in getting that group to change its mind, but what there's an absolute necessary thing to do by its appearance and manifestation is to write about it, talk about it, and get to the vulnerable groups in our society who are swayed by it, and how to make sure there's a way in which it doesn't expand, how to make sure our institutions, privileged as we are in this country, but now how tenuous they seem in the face of some of this, how we find ways to strengthen the institutions, to have institutional blockage to this. But recognize the evil, understand how it operates, understand the ways in which it might be mitigated, and that there are times in which you may need to stand up to evil as not only a resistance to it, but maybe that's one of the few times where, bless them, Gandhi, St. Francis, and Martin Luther King don't have the sole answer. That's the first thing. The second thing is making sure that we're inclusive about our teaching and accepting that peace doesn't work all the time. Interesting experience I had in my first couple of years teaching. I was at a wonderful Quaker college in Indiana. Was very lucky the first 10 years of teaching that they wanted somebody to help them with peace studies, and did what we always do, which is find out the faculty that are teaching interesting things. And there were a historian and an English guy, both of whom were Jewish, very committed in the community, very well known in the community, but great teachers on campus who had created, even before I came, a course on the Holocaust. And I went to them, I said, "Oh, this is fabulous. Can we put you at, sort of the junior year level of courses for including as an elective in peace studies?" They're both adamant, no. There's nothing about peace in this course. This is the documentation of the worst evil that's happened in our modern times. Don't touch this with peace. And I said, I'm not going to sprinkle it with peace. What I want the students who believe in peace fervently is to see this unfold. And you do it for 14 weeks. We got to have our people in your course if they want. We won't do it until you take the course. Okay. They didn't know I had done a senior thesis on certain aspects of the Third Reich. This is good. I love this. But I took the course, and we sat down a couple of days in the summer to work out how would they, the first day of class, approach those true believing Quaker kids who were sophomores who thought they would find the crack in what nobody else had found in the Third Reich to turn people away from evil. And that was a marvelous activity. And I think I'd ask us to use current examples that we're having in our American experience. How have we so othered people that we're going to shoot them at the border without even a confrontation of who they are or why they're here? And I think the third point is, yes, we have to challenge evil and be resistant to it in the structures we have. Seriously, an $800 trillion military budget? I'm hearing politicians say, why are we putting money into Ukraine when there's people starving in our streets? Well, let's bracket Ukraine for a moment. Before there was Ukraine, it was a $750 trillion military budget, building a whole new realm of nuclear weapons that we've decided, at least thankfully, over the last 65 years, we'd never use. There's never been a greater guns and butter time in this country than we're facing now. And it's not because we're not rich enough, and it's not because we couldn't meet needs like defense of a country like Ukraine. It's because of these larger structures that continue to insist that the only way to defense and peace is build better bombs than they have. And how's that worked for us for the last 75 years? Not very good for the American people generally, given our divisions, and not very good if you look at what's going on in various corners of the world. But I think the resistance thing is very, very important. Sorry, that was such a long answer because the question was so good. Thank you so much for your interaction and for your contribution to our shared dialogue today. Thank you.